This is the private sitting room for the Princess Royal Princess Anne. She has opened up the room and opened up her schedule to do something she rarely does, conduct an interview with us about things she doesn't often talk about.
Princess Anne confirms shocking secret announcement. On Camilla's future, Charles left stunned. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the title is pointing to something much bigger than a routine palace announcement. According to the story now being discussed, Princess Anne allegedly confirmed a confidential decision concerning Queen Camilla's future after officials had been reviewing her duties, public appearances, and long-term role. And the reason Charles was reportedly left stunned was not simply the decision itself. It was the fact that Anne was prepared to confirm it when the king apparently expected the matter to remain behind closed doors. Now watch this carefully. The alleged announcement was not presented as a small adjustment to Camilla's diary. It reportedly concerned the position she could hold within the royal family going forward, the responsibilities attached to that position, and the machinery surrounding her public role. That is why Anne's involvement mattered. She was not merely passing along palace gossip. In this account, she was the royal who allegedly forced a private recommendation into the open, creating a problem that Charles could no longer quietly manage. And there was another detail that made the situation more serious. The recommendation had reportedly been handled with unusual secrecy. Advisors had been examining Camilla's official duties and future appearances, while questions were being raised about what her role should look like over the longer term. Charles, according to the account, believed he understood the direction of those discussions. Then Anne allegedly confirmed that something had already moved much further than he realized. Hi viewers, if you think Princess Anne was right to speak up when something this important was being kept quiet from Charles, would you have done the same? Comment Anne was right if you believe she should have confirmed it. And if you want more royal stories that get past the polished public statements and into the questions the palace would rather leave unanswered, subscribe now, because this is exactly the kind of story where the smallest detail changes the entire picture. The first shock came when the nature of the recommendation became clearer. Senior advisors were reportedly considering more than Camilla's next public appearances. They were looking at the structure surrounding her role, the official duties she might continue, the engagements she might undertake, and the way her position could be managed in the years ahead. None of those subjects sounds explosive on its own. Put together, however, they point toward a much larger question. What exactly is Camilla's future supposed to look like? That question had reportedly become difficult to avoid. Camilla had spent years carrying out public duties beside Charles, appearing at major events, supporting charities, attending ceremonies, and representing the crown. A discussion about her future, therefore, could not be reduced to a simple change of schedule. Any alteration in her official responsibilities could affect staff, communications, invitations, patronages, and the public understanding of where she stands.
It is the monarch that is the key to this, and the constitution that underpins the monarchy. We as a family see ourselves there as to support that role.
And this is where Anne allegedly became uncomfortable. According to the account, she questioned why the matter had been kept so tightly controlled. She wanted to know why a decision involving Camilla's long-term position was being discussed through a restricted circle, while the king was apparently not being given the complete picture. That question changed the atmosphere, because if the recommendation was harmless, why the secrecy? And if Charles already knew everything, why did Anne need to confirm anything? Those two questions became the pressure points. The palace, in this account, was dealing with a problem that could not be solved simply by issuing a polished statement. The moment Anne confirmed that a decision existed, attention naturally shifted toward what the decision actually contained. Every vague phrase about future duties sounded different. Every reference to continuity raised another question. Every attempt to describe the matter as routine invited suspicion. Charles was reportedly confronted with that reality at the worst possible moment. He was not simply hearing that advisors had been discussing Camilla. He was allegedly learning that the discussion had produced a recommendation serious enough to prepare for a possible announcement. And once a recommendation reaches that stage, the balance changes. A private review can be delayed. A possible announcement creates expectations. Officials begin preparing language. Advisors begin anticipating questions. Staff begin considering consequences. The story develops momentum. Anne understood that. That may be why her alleged confirmation carried such weight. She had spent decades inside the institution and was familiar with the difference between an administrative exercise and a decision that could alter the way the royal family operates. Her reputation for directness made the moment even more significant within the story. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to accuse anyone publicly. A confirmation from Anne was enough to turn whispers into something that demanded an answer, and the answer was becoming harder to control. Behind the scenes, Camilla's advisors were reportedly demanding clarification. They wanted to know what had been proposed, who had approved it, and what it would mean for Camilla's position. If the recommendation affected official duties, then the consequences could extend beyond a single announcement. It could determine which responsibilities remained hers, which would be reassigned, and how much institutional support would continue around her. That was the point where the dispute stopped looking like ordinary palace planning. It became a question of authority. Who decides what Camilla's future looks like? Who has the final say when advisors recommend a change? And why would Princess Anne be the person confirming the development before the palace had fully explained it? Those questions were beginning to circle Charles from every direction. Yet the most important part had still not been revealed. The recommendation reportedly contained language that went beyond Camilla's immediate schedule. It dealt with the future of her position itself. That distinction matters because a person can lose a duty without losing their standing, but a change to the structure around that person can reshape how they are perceived, how they operate, and how much institutional influence remains available to them.
And I've got my father who minds an awful lot about many of the causes he's involved in and really digs down into his charitable areas as much as he can. So I have an equal sort of idea as to...
Charles, according to the account, was therefore not simply facing an announcement about his wife. He was facing a decision that could redefine what happens after the current arrangement changes. And that was precisely why Anne's confirmation was so explosive. Charles could have dismissed a rumor. He could have corrected a misunderstanding. He could have insisted that nothing had been decided. But once Anne allegedly confirmed that a serious recommendation existed, the question was no longer whether something was happening. The question became what had already been decided without everyone in the room seeing the same picture. That is where the story takes its first sharp turn. Because the people examining Camilla's future were reportedly not asking only what she should do next month, next year, or at the next major royal event. They were asking what her role should become when the monarchy itself moves into another phase. And suddenly, the secret announcement had a much larger meaning. It was no longer just about Camilla. It was about the future shape of the royal family, who would control its working machinery, and whether old arrangements would automatically survive when circumstances changed. Charles was reportedly stunned because the issue had reached that point before he expected it to. But Anne had not finished. The next part of the recommendation reportedly explained why the palace had been so careful about who saw the documents in the first place, and why revealing even one sentence could force Charles, Camilla, and the advisors to confront a question none of them could postpone forever. And if you think Anne's confirmation was serious, stay with this story, because the next revelation is where Camilla's future reportedly becomes far more complicated than anyone expected. The document had one problem that no careful advisor could hide forever. It was no longer about what Camilla would do next. It was about what authority would remain around her when the palace decided that her existing arrangement could no longer continue in the same form. That distinction was beginning to alarm people inside the story. A change to a diary could be explained in minutes. A change to duties could be described as normal planning, but a recommendation affecting the structure around a senior royal carried consequences that reached into staffing, communications, official invitations, patronages, and the public image of the monarchy itself.
And he's probably spent more time thinking about it. For the rest of us, it's more a question of, okay, we have to shift the way we support. And that's what we need to do.
According to the account, that was precisely why the review had been handled through such a narrow circle. Advisors were reportedly examining several possible arrangements rather than preparing one simple instruction. They were looking at what Camilla would continue to represent, which engagements would remain appropriate, and which responsibilities might eventually be transferred elsewhere. The language used in those discussions was reportedly careful. There was no need to describe Camilla as being removed. There was no need to announce a dramatic loss of status. The recommendation could achieve something more subtle by changing the machinery surrounding her while leaving her personal position intact. That distinction mattered. A royal can remain respected while losing an official responsibility. A royal can remain part of the family while no longer directing a particular operation. A royal can continue supporting charities while the palace decides that the surrounding staff and communications should answer to someone else. That was the direction the confidential review was allegedly exploring. And then another issue appeared. The advisors reportedly began examining what would happen to Camilla's public schedule if the proposed arrangement went ahead. Some appearances might continue because they were directly connected to causes she had supported for years. Others could require fresh approval. Invitations involving the institution could become dependent on the reigning sovereign's office rather than continuing automatically. That possibility raised a difficult question inside the palace. Where would the line be drawn between Camilla acting as a member of the royal family and Camilla acting through an established royal institution? The distinction sounds technical until it affects who receives the briefing, who approves the appearance, who controls the diary, and who speaks to the press. That was where the recommendation reportedly became sensitive. The advisors were not merely considering Camilla as an individual, they were considering the network around her. Every member of that network had a function. Staff organized engagements, communications officials handled statements, private offices managed correspondence and scheduling, patronage teams coordinated charities and organizations. Residences could provide a base for official work. Taken separately, none of those elements appeared revolutionary. Together, they could create a continuing center of influence. That was the concern reportedly being examined. The Queen Mother precedent made the question even more difficult. The existence of a former queen with a substantial public role had already demonstrated that a royal widow could remain highly visible after her husband's reign. The historical example could therefore be presented as continuity, but it could also be examined as a model that might not fit every future transition. The story's advisors were reportedly asking whether that old arrangement should be treated as an expectation or simply as a historical example. That question mattered because expectations can become powerful without ever being written into a formal rule. Once staff are established, they develop routines. Once routines exist, people begin assuming they will continue. Once a residence becomes associated with a particular royal role, that association can take on a life of its own. And once the public becomes accustomed to seeing a royal perform a certain function, changing that function can create confusion. This was the problem Anne was reportedly confronting. She was not simply asking whether Camilla deserved to continue serving. She was asking whether an arrangement built during one phase of the monarchy should automatically carry forward into another. And that question put Charles in an uncomfortable position. As king, He had a personal interest in Camilla's future. As sovereign, he also had to consider the institution beyond his own reign. Those two perspectives could point in different directions. That tension explains why the recommendation reportedly caused such unease. Charles could want continuity for Camilla, while advisors worried about the structure that continuity might create. He could see continued duties as recognition of years of service, while others could see the same duties as an institutional arrangement that would need to be reconsidered later. Neither position required hostility. That was what made the disagreement harder to settle. The account suggests that Anne understood this distinction better than most. Her concern was reportedly not whether Camilla should remain visible. It was whether the palace was quietly creating an assumption that her existing role would continue without a fresh decision from whoever ultimately held the crown. If that assumption existed, Anne's intervention became much more consequential. She was challenging the idea that precedent should decide the future before the future arrived. And once that question entered the discussion, another name inevitably became important: William. The future king could inherit not only the crown, but also every expectation attached to the previous reign. If the machinery surrounding Camilla continued automatically, William could eventually find himself operating within an institutional arrangement he had never personally chosen. That possibility reportedly interested the advisors because it transformed the issue from a dispute about one person into a question about succession. What happens to a working royal household when the sovereign changes? Who decides which offices continue? Who decides which responsibilities end? And can a former consort retain institutional structures simply because they existed during the previous reign? Those questions reportedly became central to the recommendation. Catherine's position also mattered because she represented another possible future. If the principle was applied consistently, it could eventually affect any surviving consort, regardless of popularity, seniority, or years of service. That gave the proposal a different character. It was no longer easy to describe it as a measure aimed specifically at Camilla. If the same principle could apply to future royal families, then the palace could defend it as a structural rule rather than a personal judgment. That was exactly the sort of protection advisors would need if they wanted the recommendation to survive public scrutiny. But there was still a problem. A rule can be presented as neutral, while its first real test remains intensely personal. Camilla would be the person standing inside that test, and Charles would be the person forced to watch it happen. The alleged review therefore reached a dangerous stage. Officials could continue discussing options privately, but every additional person who learned the details increased the chance of a leak, a misunderstanding, or a competing version of the story. Anne's confirmation had already created pressure. Now the question was whether the palace could control the announcement before the recommendation controlled the palace. The answer would also reveal whether Anne had exposed a genuine palace disagreement, or something far more serious that had already moved beyond private discussion inside Windsor. That is where the story's next confrontation begins. Because once Charles understood that the review concerned more than Camilla's schedule, he reportedly wanted to know who had authorized the recommendation, what had already been agreed, and whether the decision was still open to change. Those questions were about to force the king into a conversation he had not expected to have. And if this account makes you think Anne should not have been pressured into silence over a decision affecting Camilla's future, prove it by liking this video and subscribing. Stay with the story, because the next part puts Charles directly in front of the answer he was reportedly never prepared to hear. The room reportedly changed when Charles asked for the full recommendation. He was no longer listening for reassurance. He wanted names, decisions, and the precise point at which a review about Camilla's future had become something serious enough for Anne to confirm. The advisors could no longer hide behind broad language about continuity. Charles wanted to know what had actually been placed before the palace. According to the account, the answer was uncomfortable because the recommendation had been built around a principle rather than a single event. Camilla's future would not necessarily be treated as a continuation of everything she had done beside Charles. Instead, each part of her public role could be reconsidered according to its connection with the crown. That meant the palace could separate Camilla's personal position from her institutional responsibilities. Charles reportedly understood the distinction immediately. If Camilla remained a respected member of the family, that did not automatically mean every office supporting her would remain unchanged. If she continued charitable work, that did not necessarily mean every royal engagement would continue. If she remained publicly visible, that did not guarantee the same level of official machinery around her. The recommendation was therefore more precise than a simple reduction. It created a question of renewal. Would Camilla's future responsibilities continue because they already existed, or would they continue only when the sovereign's household decided that they still served the monarchy? That was the issue Charles reportedly found difficult to accept, and Charles knew it. For him, the distinction was personal. Camilla had shared the pressure of royal life, endured scrutiny, and taken on responsibilities that came with standing beside the king. A recommendation that treated those responsibilities as temporary could feel like an assessment of everything she had contributed. But the advisors were reportedly looking at something different. They were looking at the machinery that followed the role. That machinery could include staff, communications support, scheduling arrangements, official invitations, patronages, and access to institutional resources. None of those elements automatically disappeared simply because a recommendation changed. They had to be reassigned, reviewed, or justified. And that was where the consequences became real. If Camilla's official role changed, people working around her would need to know who they answered to. If her communications operation changed, statements would need a different route. If certain patronages moved elsewhere, organizations that had worked with her for years could suddenly face a new arrangement. The palace could not alter one part without examining the others. Charles reportedly asked whether the recommendation meant Camilla would lose everything. The answer was no. That answer did not make the situation easier. The proposal was designed to preserve dignity while limiting automatic institutional continuity. Camilla could remain family. She could continue causes she cared about. She could appear at selected occasions, but the structure supporting those activities would depend on decisions made by the reigning household. That was the line Anne had been trying to expose. The issue was whether Camilla's existing position would continue by default. Charles reportedly pushed back on the idea that precedent should suddenly be treated as irrelevant. The monarchy had always depended on continuity. Families changed, reigns changed, and arrangements evolved. But institutions often survived because someone chose to preserve them. Yet there was another side. Continuity could protect the monarchy from disruption, but continuity could also make old arrangements seem permanent. Once a system had existed for years, removing it could appear extraordinary even when the next sovereign had never agreed to maintain it. William reportedly understood that problem. His position, as described in the account, was not that Camilla should be punished. It was that the next reign should have authority to decide its own working structure. That meant Charles was being asked to think beyond his current reign. He had spent years preparing for the crown. Now the recommendation forced him to imagine what happened after it passed to William. That was the moment the conversation became personal. Charles reportedly asked what William would do if Camilla were still active when he became king. William's answer was careful. He would respect her. He would listen to her. He would support her as family. But respect, support, and institutional authority were not necessarily the same thing. That distinction reportedly left Charles silent, because it meant Camilla's future could depend less on what existed today and more on what the next sovereign chose tomorrow. Then Anne reportedly made the point even more directly. The monarchy could not promise every future royal that machinery from one reign would follow them indefinitely. If it did, every transition would carry an expanding collection of offices, staff structures, and expectations into the next generation. The result could be a monarchy with several overlapping centers of influence. That was precisely what the recommendation was allegedly designed to prevent. Charles reportedly understood the institutional argument, but that did not remove the emotional cost. He asked what would happen to the causes Camilla had spent years supporting. The response was that the causes themselves could continue. The question was, who would administer and represent them under the future arrangement? That difference mattered. It meant the proposal did not erase Camilla's work. It questioned whether the crown should permanently guarantee the infrastructure surrounding it. For Charles, that was a difficult distinction to defend publicly. Any explanation could be interpreted as a slight against Camilla. Any silence could make the palace appear secretive. Any denial could become difficult if Anne's confirmation was already circulating. The king was therefore caught between two problems. He needed to protect Camilla's position without appearing to dictate the future structure of a reign that would eventually belong to William, and Anne's intervention had made the issue impossible to keep entirely private. The advisors reportedly suggested that the safest response was to clarify the principle before the announcement became defined by rumor. But Charles still had one question. Why had Anne confirmed it? That question changed the focus again. Anne's answer, according to the account, was not about personal disagreement with Camilla. She reportedly believed that if a recommendation could affect the future of the monarchy, it should not remain hidden behind vague language until the public was presented with a finished decision. Her position was blunt. A transition should be planned openly enough for the people affected by it to understand what is coming. That answer put Charles in an uncomfortable position because it implied that secrecy itself had become part of the problem. The king reportedly looked again at the recommendation. The issue was no longer simply whether the proposal was fair to Camilla. It was whether the palace had handled the process fairly at all. And that was the point at which Charles reportedly realized that the controversy surrounding Anne's confirmation could not be contained by correcting one sentence or denying one rumor. Something deeper had happened. A private discussion had become a test of trust inside the royal family. Anne had challenged the secrecy. William had defended the principle of future authority. Advisors had defended the need for planning. Charles had been forced to confront the consequences. And Camilla still had not heard the full explanation directly. That final detail was about to become the most difficult part. Because Charles could question the advisors. He could challenge William. He could demand clarification from Anne. But once Camilla entered the conversation, the institutional argument would collide with the personal reality. And that was when the decision concerning her future would stop being a document on a palace desk and become a question she could no longer avoid. If you believe Anne's confirmation exposed something the public deserved to understand, do not scroll away now. Like this video, subscribe, and stay with the story, because the next part is where Camilla reportedly hears what the decision could mean for her personally. Camilla reportedly entered the discussion expecting an explanation. What she encountered instead was a decision that had already been shaped around the future of the monarchy. According to the account, the atmosphere changed as soon as she understood that Anne had confirmed the existence of a serious recommendation. This was no longer a question of whether advisors had been reviewing possibilities. The review had reportedly reached a point where the consequences had to be explained. Camilla wanted to know what had been decided. The answer was carefully framed. Her personal position was not being erased. Her dignity was not being questioned. Her place within the family was not being challenged. The issue concerned something more specific, the institutional structure surrounding her public role. That distinction sounded reasonable until the practical consequences became clear. Camilla could remain visible without controlling a separate operation. She could continue supporting causes without automatically retaining every official responsibility. She could attend major occasions without assuming that every invitation or appearance would continue under the same arrangements. In other words, the proposal reportedly separated recognition from authority. That was difficult for Camilla to absorb. For years, the two had existed together. Her public work had been connected to the institution around Charles. Her diary, staff, communications, engagements, and charitable commitments formed part of a wider royal system. Now that system was being reconsidered. Camilla reportedly asked the question that had been hanging over the entire dispute. If Charles remained king, what exactly would change? The answer was that the immediate position could remain largely intact while preparations were made for the future. The recommendation was not necessarily designed to alter everything overnight. It was designed to prevent an automatic continuation of the same structure when the circumstances of the monarchy eventually changed. That answer shifted the argument again. The real issue was not tomorrow. It was what happened after tomorrow. Camilla reportedly understood that. She asked whether the proposal meant that her future would depend on whoever came after Charles. That was the uncomfortable truth at the center of the recommendation. A future sovereign would have the authority to determine the working structure of that reign. Camilla could remain important, respected, and active, but the machinery supporting her would not necessarily belong to her by right. For Charles, that distinction had already been difficult. For Camilla, hearing it directly was reportedly even harder. She had not spent years preparing for a royal role, simply to discover that the institutional framework around it could eventually be reconsidered. But the proposal contained another complication. It was reportedly written in a way that avoided naming Camilla as the problem. There was no need to say that she should disappear. There was no need to suggest that she had failed. There was no need to attack her reputation. Instead, the recommendation focused on a principle that could apply to any future royal consort. That wording was deliberate. If the rule were written specifically around Camilla, critics could immediately describe it as personal. If it applied to every future transition, the palace could present it as a structural decision. And that was where Catherine's position became important. According to the account, Catherine was prepared to accept the same principle herself. That detail reportedly changed Camilla's reaction. If Catherine were willing to accept that a future sovereign should control the working structure of the monarchy, then the proposal could no longer be dismissed as a restriction designed only for one woman. The principle would apply regardless of popularity. It would apply regardless of years served. It would apply regardless of how deeply a former consort had become associated with the institution. That was the point William and Catherine were reportedly trying to establish. The crown could survive changes in personnel. The institution could survive changes in households. But the next sovereign had to be allowed to define the machinery of the next reign. Camilla reportedly asked whether that meant she would simply be pushed aside. The answer was no. But it was also not the reassurance she wanted. She could remain part of the family. She could continue personal interests. She could support causes. She could appear publicly. But official institutional authority would depend on the decisions of the reigning sovereign. That was the boundary. And boundaries become most uncomfortable when everyone understands exactly where they are. Charles reportedly watched Camilla carefully as the explanation continued. The king had spent much of the discussion trying to separate his personal responsibility toward his wife from the constitutional reality of his office. Now Camilla was confronting that same distinction herself. She could ask Charles to protect her. But Charles could not promise that every arrangement surrounding his reign would survive him. That was the point where the emotional pressure reportedly intensified. Camilla was not being told that her years of service meant nothing. She was being told that those years did not automatically guarantee permanent institutional authority. There was a difference, a painful one. The conversation reportedly became quieter as Camilla considered it. Then Anne's role returned to the center. Camilla wanted to understand why Anne had confirmed the matter instead of allowing Charles and the palace advisors to handle it privately. Anne's alleged position was straightforward. If the recommendation affected the future structure of the monarchy, silence could create a bigger problem later. The palace could not expect people to accept a major change if they were deliberately kept uncertain about what was being considered. That explanation did not make Camilla comfortable, but it did make the dispute clearer. Anne was not necessarily arguing that Camilla should lose her position. She was reportedly arguing that the future should not be decided through assumptions inherited from the past. That was a much more difficult position to attack. It also created a new question. If the recommendation was truly a general principle, who else would eventually fall under it? The answer reportedly extended beyond Camilla. Any future surviving consort could face the same distinction between personal dignity and institutional authority. That meant Catherine could face it. A future spouse of George could face it. Even future generations of the royal family could eventually operate under the same expectation. Suddenly, Camilla was no longer standing alone at the center of the dispute. She was standing at the beginning of a possible new royal precedent. That changed the emotional weight of the moment, because the recommendation was not necessarily saying that Camilla had done something wrong. It was saying that the monarchy might no longer guarantee that a previous consort's institutional world would travel automatically into the next reign. For Charles, that represented a major change in the assumptions he had grown accustomed to. For Camilla, it represented uncertainty. For William, it represented freedom to shape the future. And for Anne, it represented a question of whether the institution should confront that future before circumstances forced it to. But there was still one part of the proposal that had not been fully addressed. Where would Camilla actually stand if the next reign began while she was still active? Would she retain a formal working role? Would existing patronages continue? Would staff remain attached to her? Would her communications operation continue independently? And most importantly, would a royal residence continue to function as a base for her public work? That last question was the one capable of turning an internal disagreement into a visible palace confrontation. Because a residence is not simply a building when it carries decades of royal history. It can become a symbol of authority. It can become a place where staff gather, visitors are received, charities are supported, and public duties continue. And if the new principle meant one central royal household, then the future of that residence could not be ignored. Camilla reportedly understood the implication before anyone said it aloud. Charles understood it too. The room had started with a question about Camilla's future. It was now moving toward the question of what would happen to the physical and institutional structures connected to that future. And that was where the situation became far more serious. Because Anne's confirmation had opened the door. Charles had now seen what was behind it. Camilla had heard the explanation, but the most sensitive question had still not been answered. Who would control the royal household when the next reign began? If you believe the public deserves to know when decisions this consequential are being made behind closed doors, like this video, subscribe, and stay here. The next part takes the dispute from Camilla's personal future to the decision that could determine exactly where she stands when the crown eventually passes to William. The most revealing part of Princess Anne's alleged confirmation was not the announcement itself. It was what happened after the palace could no longer treat Camilla's future as a private administrative matter. The question had moved beyond duties and appearances. It had reached the heart of the next reign. According to the account, the unresolved issue was Clarence House and the authority attached to it. If the next sovereign was expected to operate through one principal household, then a residence associated with a previous royal structure could not simply continue under old assumptions. That made the building a symbol of the larger dispute. Charles reportedly understood why this mattered immediately. A residence can look like a piece of property from the outside. Inside a royal system, it can become a working base. Staff can operate from it. Visitors can be received there. Charitable work can be coordinated there. Communications can move through it. Its very existence can suggest that the person associated with it still possesses an established institutional role. The alleged recommendation pointed toward the second option. It did not necessarily demand that Camilla disappear from public life. It did not require her to abandon every cause she supported. It did not erase her relationship with Charles or her place within the family. Instead, it reportedly rejected the idea that the machinery surrounding a previous reign should continue automatically. The change was not simply about one woman. It was about the rules governing what happens when a sovereign's reign ends. For Charles, that was difficult because the decision forced him to look at the monarchy from the other side of his own reign. He had spent decades preparing to become king. Now he was being asked to imagine the institution after his own authority had passed to William. And in that future, Camilla's position would no longer be guaranteed by the arrangements created during Charles's reign. That did not mean she would have no place. It meant her place would have to be defined by the next sovereign. This was the point that reportedly left Charles stunned. The decision was not being framed as a punishment against Camilla. It was being framed as a boundary around the crown itself. William would inherit the monarchy. He would inherit responsibility. He would also inherit the right to decide how his working household operated. That principle could eventually apply to every future generation. A surviving consort might remain loved, respected, active, and deeply connected to the family. But the institutional machinery of a previous reign would not automatically follow that person into the next one. She had allegedly seen enough of royal transitions to understand how quickly temporary arrangements can become permanent expectations. Once staff are established, offices created, residences associated with a role, and public duties repeated for years, people begin to treat those arrangements as though they were guaranteed. Anne's alleged intervention challenged that assumption. The future could not be allowed to arrive carrying obligations nobody had consciously chosen. That was why her confirmation mattered. She had reportedly forced the palace to confront a decision that might otherwise have remained buried inside private briefings. Princess Anne's shocking confirmation, as presented in this account, was significant because it exposed a decision about what Camilla's future could look like once the monarchy moved beyond Charles. The real pressure point was not whether Camilla remained part of the royal family. It was whether she would automatically carry the institutional weight of Charles's reign into William's. The answer appeared to be no. That possibility is exactly what made the palace recommendation so sensitive internally. But there was still an important qualification. A future king could choose to involve her. He could invite her to major occasions. He could support selected causes. He could preserve certain public responsibilities. He could decide that her experience remained valuable to the crown. What would change was the assumption that those arrangements belonged to her automatically. Authority would come from the reigning sovereign. It changes who approves. It changes who communicates. It changes who manages staff. It changes who controls the diary. It changes who decides whether a residence remains part of an official operation. Charles reportedly left the discussion understanding that reality. The man who had once expected continuity to carry forward was now confronting a different model. One reign would end, another would begin, and the new sovereign would have to be free to define the institution around himself. It was not simply a royal family dispute. It was a test of whether tradition should automatically determine the future. And the answer emerging from the story was clear. Tradition could inform the next reign. It could not command it. That left Clarence House as the final unresolved symbol. If the principle were ever implemented, the residence would have to be examined alongside the staff, offices, communications arrangements, and public duties connected to it. Would it remain a working base? Would it become primarily private? Would another arrangement be created? Those questions were still open, and that uncertainty may be the most important detail of all. Because the palace could announce a principle tomorrow, but the real test would come when that principle had to affect a real residence, real staff, real responsibilities, and a real person who had spent years serving beside the king. And that is why the alleged announcement surrounding Camilla's future has drawn so much attention. It points toward a possible change in how the royal family handles the end of one reign and the beginning of another. For Charles, the shock was reportedly personal. For Anne, the issue was allegedly institutional. For William, it was about the freedom of the next crown. For Camilla, it was about discovering that respect and authority may not always travel together. And for the monarchy itself, the question remains whether the future will continue to follow the patterns established by previous generations, or whether the next reign will draw a much harder line. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard instead of buried behind palace silence, do not just watch and move on. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the royal family, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications. Staying silent lets the unanswered questions disappear. Standing with this channel means refusing to let the important details be brushed aside. So stay with us, because the next video coming on this channel gets even more revealing, and what happens next could make this entire dispute look small.